In the early hours of July 8th, 2004, torrential rain was falling in Seoul. The loud thuds of heavy raindrops were all that could be heard. It was the kind of weather that makes you want to stay inside. But for two people, it would have been better if they hadn't. It was in these early hours of the morning, two people were brutally murdered in an apartment on the third floor of a multi-unit residential building in the Yongdap-dong neighborhood, Seongdong district, Seoul, South Korea. One was a woman in her 30s. The other was a little girl who had just turned 12. The homeowners had stepped out for a while. In their absence, both victims were stabbed to death where they lay in bed. At first glance, the scene looked as though someone had simply descended on them while they slept, and yet the front door was completely intact. There was no sign of forced entry from the outside. So who had come into that apartment that night, and why did they want to take two lives in such a horrific way? These are the questions that 22 years later, the victims' families are still searching for answers to. This is the story of the 2004 Yongdap-dong neighborhood murders, one of South Korea's most confusing cold cases. Most of us spend a fair amount of time just waiting, for an order, for someone running late, for the day to wind down, and we fill it by scrolling. I started thinking about how much of that time adds up and whether any of it could actually pay off. And that's what led me to this app called FreeCash. And I wasn't convinced at first because these things usually promise more than they deliver, but I figured there was no harm in testing it. So I actually tried it, and it's really simple. You pick a game or task, complete it, earn coins, and cash out. And of course, you will have to do certain things like downloading the game and turning on app tracking so the rewards count. I chose a game that I already play, and I just went from there. And to be very clear, this won't make you rich, obviously, and it does require a lot of time. But considering I'm on my phone anyway, it's a reasonable trade. The same routine, with a small payoff attached. If you're concerned it might not be legitimate, they have hundreds of thousands of Trustpilot reviews and a 4.7-star rating. It's not instant, but they do pay. The link's below if you want to try it, and signing up through mine gets you a $10 bonus after your first offer, and it's entirely free. It's a practical way to make your downtime count for a little more, so why not? Enjoy. No one knows exactly what happened inside that apartment. When the homeowners came back, all they found were the two bodies. Park Eun-hee was discovered first, in the spare room. Eun-hee was a close acquaintance of the family who was living with them at the time. She was believed to have fallen asleep watching television in that room earlier that night. She never woke up. Her body had 18 stab wounds. The deepest and most fatal was a wound directly to the heart. Her hands showed unmistakable defensive wounds, evidence that she had woken up at some point and tried to shield herself. But there was no stopping such a frantic attack. Forensic specialists concluded that Eun-hee had been asleep when the first blow came. She was lying in bed when she was stabbed. She came to for a moment, flailing her arms trying to protect herself, and that's what left the marks on her hands. But it wasn't enough. What they found in the main bedroom was even harder to look at. The couple's only daughter, Yeonu, a 12-year-old girl, lying in her bed, dead. She too appeared to have been attacked in her sleep. Yeonu had no defensive wounds at all. There were stab marks in the blanket, in the exact position where she had been lying. The blade had come while she was asleep, exactly as she lay. She left this world without ever knowing what was happening to her. The cause of death was a stab wound to the neck. The cut was so precise and so devastating that even the forensic examiners were shaken. One clean cut to the throat of a child. That was not the work of someone swinging a knife in a blind rage. The forensic team took particular note of this. In some ways, Yeonu's injuries were even more disturbing than Eun-hee's. The wound had the quality of something deliberate and practiced, not a wound inflicted through an act of panic, not an act of anger, but something almost ritualistic, far beyond what would have been needed to silence her. So there was intention here. There was meaning in it. The police launched their investigation. First, they assessed the scene. The front door showed no signs of being forced. No damage to the lock, no damage to the frame. Everything intact and properly latched. So how had someone gotten in and how had they gotten out? They swept every inch of the building inside and out, and then they find a critical clue as to how the killer got in. On the roof of the second-floor veranda, located directly below the crime scene on the third floor, they discovered footprints, 5 of them. The killer had come in from the rooftop of an adjacent building. They had crossed from that roof onto the roof of the second-floor veranda, walked across it, and climbed in through a third-floor balcony window that had been left open. It was a dangerous approach. Each footprint told its own story. When investigators compared the faint footprints found inside the apartment to those on the veranda roof, they matched perfectly. The same size, the same tread pattern, 1 pair of shoes. That also confirmed they were looking for a single perpetrator acting alone. The shoes were a Korean size 280, equivalent to a US men's size 10, a shoe size that was well above the average for Korean men at the time. The specific type of sneakers were also identified as a style that had been manufactured about 6 years before the crime and sold at Dongdaemun Market. That was a significant lead. Now all they had to do was find the person who had been wearing those shoes. As the investigation progressed, one name kept surfacing: Oh Chang-sik, Eunhee's ex-boyfriend. He had visited the third-floor apartment on at least 2 occasions while the two were dating. He knew the place. And of course, that's not much on its own, but there was something else. Chang-sik had multiple prior convictions for burglary. It wasn't just something he'd done once or twice. It was a pattern of behavior. He was a man who knew how to get into homes he wasn't invited into. The police named him as their primary suspect. Their theory went like this. Chang-sik had entered the apartment intending to kill Eunhee. And when he realized that 12-year-old Yeonu, a girl who knew his face, was there too, he killed her to eliminate her as a witness. And Chang-sik's behavior on the day of the crime was also deeply suspicious. That same afternoon, after the murders, he had been seen wearing brand new sneakers, and he had abandoned his motorcycle in a neighborhood across Seoul. A motorcycle with no license plate. Why get rid of such a precious commodity? Why switch to new shoes? Something seemed off. A friend of Chang-sik's gave a statement as well. This friend had seen Chang-sik on the day of the murders. According to the friend, Chang-sik had told him that he'd disposed of his motorcycle, announced he was about to leave for China, and asked the friend to transport some belongings in his car over to Chang-sik's mother's house. He looked exactly like a man preparing to run. The police arrested Chang-sik, and under questioning, he confessed. He even participated in a crime scene reconstruction. An investigator who worked on the case would later say that information Chang-sik provided corroborated witness testimony and included details that only the killer would know. The case finally looked like it was going well. Then it all fell apart in court. The moment Chang-sik stood before a judge, he took back every word of his confession. He said he had been coerced. Chang-sik acknowledged that his behavior that day had looked suspicious, but he had his own explanation. He said he'd learned of Eunhee's death from a police officer who came to his mother's house, and the shock of that news had caused him to act erratically. The court stated that the prosecution's evidence lacked evidentiary validity. The investigation hadn't uncovered what it needed to hold the case together. And so, Oh Chang-sik was acquitted. But as time passed, experts began raising serious doubts about whether Chang-sik had ever been the real killer. When they compared the facts to elements of the crime scene, too much didn't fit. There was a height issue, for one. Based on the size 280 shoe print, specialists estimated the killer's height, standard proportional calculation. A person wearing that size shoe would have feet that were around 266 millimeters long. This would suggest the killer's height to be roughly 179 centimeters, about 5 feet 10 inches tall. Oh Chang-sik was more than 11 centimeters shorter than that. Shoe size and height obviously don't correspond perfectly, but an 11 centimeter gap puts him well outside the typical range for someone wearing 280 shoes. Other doubts followed. If Chang-sik had gone to that apartment planning to kill Eunhee, he would have needed at least some preparation. Time spent watching the place, timing his entry, learning when no one else would be home. But Yeonwoo was there that night, and Chang-sik had visited that apartment while dating Eunhee. He knew who lived there. The idea that he walked in completely blind without any reconnaissance was hard to accept. The expert's conclusion was clear. Too many things didn't add up for Chang-sik to be the killer, which meant the real perpetrator was still out there somewhere. Someone around 179 centimeters tall, wearing size 280 shoes, capable of scaling buildings in the dark and wielding a knife with terrifying precision. Who could fit that description? With the investigation stalled, another person came under suspicion. A man who lived in the building just behind the crime scene. He said he had heard someone rushing down the stairs right after the killings and had come outside to look. At first, he was just a witness. Then, gradually, he became a suspect. His account was specific. He said he'd seen a motorcycle, dark-colored, ridden by someone in a dark raincoat, which happened to match the description of the motorcycle Oh Chang-sik would dispose of later that day. So at first, it seemed like pure coincidence. But as police looked more closely at this man, things started to feel off. The first thing that raised flags was that he had visible scratch marks on his body. Fresh-looking marks right around the time of the crime. The kind of marks you might get if you'd caught yourself on something. And then, investigators found something even more alarming. His shoe size was also 280, a perfect match to the footprint at the scene. And when police tested his rooftop room with luminol, they got a positive reaction for blood. Every indicator pointed in his direction. He lived in a building with direct rooftop access to the exact approach route the killer had used. But every single suspicion turned out to be wrong. The scratches, he explained them as marks from the broken iron handle on the door of his rooftop bathroom. Nothing to do with the crime. The blood, a false positive. And a size 280 shoe, while above average, wasn't rare enough in South Korea to be treated as damning evidence. The man in the building was cleared. Years passed, and then something else came to light. It was 2012. A man serving a life sentence drew a picture while in prison. In the drawing, 2 women, a dog, a fence, the interior of the Yongdap-dong neighborhood crime scene. The prisoner's name was Lee Byung-ju. Lee claimed he knew about the Yongdap-dong case. He told prosecutors he had heard about it from a co-conspirator of his. He spoke as though he had information about the real killer. Investigators went to talk to him immediately, but there was a glaring inconsistency in his account. In his conversations with prosecutors, Lee referred to the 2 victims as mother and daughter, as though Park Eun-hee were Yeonwoo's mother. But that was simply wrong. Park Eun-hee was a family friend, not Yeonwoo's mother. The 2 had no familiar relationship whatsoever. If Lee had genuinely received detailed information from someone close to the crime, there was no way he would have gotten that basic fact so wrong. Byung-ju also had written notes. They looked almost like a personal code, things jotted down so he wouldn't forget what he'd heard. But even those notes contained inaccuracies that didn't match the known details of the case. The conclusion was straightforward. Lee Byung-ju hadn't committed the Yongdap-dong murders. He hadn't even spoken directly with anyone who had. He'd picked up fragments through the prison grapevine and inflated them into something that sounded like insider knowledge. On top of everything else, Byung-ju was 160 centimeters tall. The estimated height of the Yongdap-dong killer was 179 centimeters, a 19-centimeter gap. He wasn't the man. Another theory had fallen through. But Byung-ju's appearance had introduced one new possibility. If he had heard something in a prison, even a distorted version of the story, then it could mean the real killer might be behind bars for something else. And whoever told Byung-ju the story might be a person worth finding. The investigation took on a new direction. What investigators turned their focus to next was a member of the household I haven't mentioned yet. Gami. Gami was the family's dog, present in the apartment the night of the murders. Gami was the sole witness, but she hadn't been left alive. However, what Gami left behind turned out to be a meaningful clue. Along the walls of the spare room, the room where Pagani was killed, investigators found traces of Gami's movements forming an L shape around the perimeter. These were the marks of repeated movement, frantic, desperate movement. An animal trying to escape from something. Specialists study the patterns. Dogs, when frightened, instinctively seek out enclosed spaces, the narrow gap between furniture and a wall, under a bed, behind a wardrobe. They press themselves into dark, tight spaces as a survival response. Gami had apparently hidden behind the bed where Pagani lay, and the killer had gone after her. Evidence throughout the room showed the bed had been moved multiple times, pushed from different directions, shifted again and again as someone reached underneath trying to get at the dog. This wasn't one quick attempt to catch the dog. The killer had spent real time on this. Experts treated this as one of the most significant elements of the entire crime. 2 people had just been killed, and this person, instead of leaving, was spending time trying to catch a small dog. And it was unusual behavior, and it raised another critical question. In trying to catch a terrified animal, the killer had almost certainly made contact with Gami at some point. A frightened dog doesn't go quietly. It kicks, scratches, bites, and claws with everything it has. The killer had very likely been scratched or bitten by Gami, which meant Gami may have had something on her. Skin cells, hair, biological traces that could be tied to a specific person. No DNA from the killer had been found on either victim, but Gami was different. According to expert analysis, it was estimated that Gami had been in direct contact with the killer for around 20 minutes. Under her nails, in her mouth, there could have been something there. But at the time, no one thought to run a DNA analysis on the dog. More potentially decisive evidence, gone. From the scene as a whole, investigators and profilers began assembling a picture of who this person was. First, it was likely someone familiar with the building. The rooftop approach to that 3rd floor balcony was not something you'd stumble onto by accident. You'd have to go there, look around, and work it out in person. This was someone who had been to the scene before. Second, someone with military training. The wound to Yanu's neck, precise, intentional, devastating, was not the kind of thing a person achieves by accident. That's the kind of incapacitation technique taught to people who are trained to kill. It pointed to someone from a military background or someone with professional experience handling bladed weapons. Third, someone carrying deep, concentrated rage, stabbing one victim 18 times, a ritualistic, near ceremonial cut to a child's throat. This wasn't the appearance of a robbery gone wrong. This was a targeted act of violence, an expression of anger, or something even darker. Profilers had one more concern. A person capable of something like this almost never stops at one murder. The Yongdap-dong killer, they believed, had almost certainly committed other crimes, which meant there was a real possibility the killer had since been caught and was already in prison, serving time for something else. And there was one more theory that kept coming up. It was possibly a contract killing. Someone had hired this person to get rid of Pagani. The level of preparation, the precision, the absence of obvious motive connecting the killer to the victims personally, it all fit the profile of someone who was paid to do it. If that was true, the person who ordered it was still out there, completely free. But none of these theories led anywhere concrete. Oh Chang-shik walked free. The man living next door was eliminated from suspicion. The prisoner's story fell apart. 5 footprints, size 280 shoes, an estimated height of 179 centimeters, a handful of fragments of evidence, and then nothing. The real killer had disappeared into the darkness completely. The shadow that climbed through that open balcony window in the early hours of that July morning had never come back into the light. It has been around 22 years since the murders. The case remains unsolved. The family that lost Pagani, the parents who lost 12-year-old Yanu, they are still living without answers, without even knowing who walked into their home that night or why. To lose the people you love most in such a brutal way, and then to spend 2 decades not knowing the first thing about why it happened or who did it, there is no greater anguish than that. But there is one minor hope. South Korea abolished the statute of limitations for murder in 2015, which means there is no timer ticking down on this case. Wherever the killer is, whatever they're doing, however many years passed, they will never be safe. As long as they're alive, prosecution remains possible. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened that night. If the profilers are right, the killer may already be sitting in a prison cell for something else. Or they may have told someone, at some point, a fragment of a story that escaped. A single new lead, even a small one, could reopen everything. That is all for today. Thanks for watching. And if you haven't yet, my FreeCash link is below. The $10 bonus is there after your first offer. Free to join and an easy way to get something back from time you'd spent regardless.